Hello, hello, hello. For those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I am Margaret Lowe. I am the CEO of WBUR. I've, thank you. I've actually been on the job for 5 weeks now, and I'm absorbing, so I know everything. So I'm absorbing so much as I get to know the people and the place and begin to chart our course. But here's what I already know. Those of you in this room are among the most important people in our lives, especially because you made it here despite this incredibly messy weather out here. So thank you so much for that. It gives me so much pleasure to welcome all of you, the members of the Murrow Society. I think you know that your generous support provides the fuel we need to uphold the values of Edward R. Murrow. He's the journalist who brought World War II into America's living room. He revealed the horrors of Buchenwald, and his clear-eyed reporting led to the downfall of Senator Joseph McCarthy. This broadcast pioneer was known for his honesty and for his integrity, and his reporting across the decades set the standard. So the kind of journalism that makes a difference in the world, the kind that has a real impact, requires tireless work and significant investment. So on behalf of my WBUR colleagues, thank you for all you do to make our work possible. Thank you for believing in WBUR. So this job is actually something of a homecoming for me. I grew up just a few miles from here. My parents were listeners and donors. And Tom and Ray Maiazzi, the car guys, were actually my dad's mechanics. I left at the age of 17 to go to college, and except for the summer after I graduated, I haven't lived here since. But I did spend decades of my life at NPR in Washington. I actually began as an overnight production assistant on Morning Edition. And yes, I am still glad that I get to go to bed every night. I ultimately ran the news division in the work of 400 journalists across the country and around the world. And after that, I spent 5 exhilarating years at the Atlantic magazine, which, like me, has Boston roots. But I am so happy to be back in public radio and back in this wonderful city. Yay, Boston. The power of our journalism has never been more important. Since 2004, nearly 2,000 newspapers have closed, leaving America's towns and cities, sometimes entire counties, without a meaningful source of local reporting. The profession has been devastated, and this crisis in local journalism has become a crisis for democracy. And so I actually believe that this work that I'm doing now is the most important thing I could possibly be doing. And while we've witnessed the decline in local journalism, public radio and WBUR are a beacon of hope. And with your help, we continue to grow stronger. Our investments in journalism are a direct response to the need for deep and rigorous reporting in these increasingly complicated times. And I can say this because I actually can't take any credit yet. WBUR is a jewel in the public radio crown, and it's admired by our colleagues across the country for our rich local coverage and the essential role we play in this city, covering health and education, immigration, the opioid crisis, climate change, business, technology, arts, and culture. And this past year, we launched an investigative reporting unit, and the team is going to take the time to dig deep and report stories that expose the abuse of power, corruption, and other betrayals of public trust. This is actually one of the most important editorial efforts we've undertaken, and it will inform the journalism across our newsroom. And I'm so pleased to say that this team will deliver its first series this spring. So each week, we actually reach more than 500,000 people in Boston and beyond. On air and online, our national programs like Here and Now and On Point are heard by millions and millions of listeners across the country. So if you actually consider the hours you spend with WBUR, I imagine that we are as deeply embedded in your lives as some of your closest friends, maybe even your family. But one of the things that has struck me most about being here at a local station is the intimacy of the relationship that we have with you, our audience, and how profoundly the work that we do touches your lives. I suspect that most of you followed NPR's Mary Louise Kelly and her encounter with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo a few weeks ago. Her interview with the secretary about Iran and the Ukraine was clearly tense. That may be the understatement of the evening. And instead of answering her last question, according to Mary Louise, Pompeo leaned in and glared at her, and then he stormed off. And then the secretary's aide summoned Mary Louise to Pompeo's private headquarters, and there he gave her an expletive-filled verbal lashing. Afterwards, when Mary Louise reported on what happened, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo publicly accused Mary Louise of lying about the terms of the interview. It was actually a pretty searing experience for Mary Louise, but neither she nor NPR stood down, saying the secretary's claim was blatantly false. So you flash forward. Any of you who listened to WBUR last week might just have heard that it was Valentine's Day on Friday and that we were delivering roses aplenty. Well, Mary Louise ended up with a dozen of those roses delivered to her desk at NPR, and so she wrote a note to thank me, thinking it had come from her friends and fans here at the station. And she also pointed out, she said, you're putting my husband to shame. But as it turns out, those roses were from a listener who wrote this to Mary Louise. You are the pillar of the fourth estate. Please stay strong for the rest of us. Others wrote in to say things like, I just donated $100 to honor Mary Louise Kelly and the decency, integrity, and competence for which she stands. I could go on. What is extraordinary is the depth of feeling that people have for the work that we do and the recognition that we fight hard to get at the truth, to hold power to account, and to shine light in places where there is none. If you'll indulge me, I have one more story in this same vein. Last summer, our health correspondent, Carrie Goldberg, reported on the recommendation that women of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, Eastern European Jews, consider genetic testing for BRCA mutations, which are associated with an unusually high risk of cancer, even without a family history. Just this month, long after that piece aired, this note landed in Carrie's inbox. Your story about BRCA testing for Ashkenazi Jews may have saved my life. I'm half Jewish and have no family history of breast cancer. But I heard your story and I decided to go get tested. After talking with my genetic counselor, Kaiser denied my request. Despite the recommendation you wrote about, they wouldn't do the test for someone with no family history. So I ended up paying $250 to get the test done myself. I got the results last week, and it turns out I have BRCA too. All this is to say, she wrote, thank you so much. I'm 35 and I'm done having kids, so I have some time to figure this out. But I think it's time I wouldn't have had if it wasn't for you. In a time where journalism is often under attack, I want to say that I'm really grateful for you and your profession. So are my daughters, though they are too young to know it yet. With profound gratitude. WBUR is making a mark and making a difference, and that is thank you to all of you. I'm pleased to report that through the campaign for BUR, the first in our 70-year history, March 1 is our 70th birthday, we've reached the $30 million mark. We launched this campaign so we could invest more deeply in our journalism, from the investigative team I described to our coverage of the environment, education, arts, and culture. Our goal is 40 million, so onward and upward. The campaign also made this exquisite venue possible. City Space allows us to bring together people to talk about some of the most consequential issues of our time, and we will do just that tonight. It is such a privilege to introduce our host for the evening, Robert Siegel, but I'm going to make him sit for a while longer because I'm going to talk about Robert. I met Robert nearly 40 years ago, back when I was an overnight production assistant, and he was reporting from London. And it was actually on the phone in the middle of the night. We had our first conversation. He was giving me exacting instructions on how to edit his story. And And I was trying desperately, my 23-year-old self, to sound like I had a clue. I later became his producer on All Things Considered. For a time, I was his boss, and now I'm simply his friend. We are so lucky to have him here at BUR this week, hosting On Point. Every day working with Robert was like taking a master class in journalism. Like Murrow in television, Robert Siegel set the standard for public radio. He was the host of All Things Considered for more than 30 years. He covered the ups and downs of 6 presidents, from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump. In fact, Robert Siegel and I were in the Oval Office together to interview President Clinton the day the Monica Lewinsky story broke. It was a day. During his time at NPR, Robert covered everything from politics to foreign affairs, food, and football, and it is worth noting he would never pass up a conversation with an opera diva. Robert Siegel has a knack for finding stories no one else was telling. He did it all with intelligence, rigor, originality, boundless curiosity, and an oh so wonderful laugh. As I think you know, Nicholas Burns is on the docket for tonight, but his flight from Munich was delayed. Actually, 2 of his connecting flights were canceled. I'm happy to report that he has landed at Logan Airport, and he is racing to be here. So, how lucky we are that David Gergen dropped everything to join us for the first part of this evening. David probably needs no introduction, but he is a professor of public service and founding director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. He served as White House advisor to 4 presidents, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton. Robert, I'm going to let you take it from there. Please join me in welcoming Robert Siegel and David Gergen.
Hi. Is the mic on? Yes, there it is. Thank you for that introduction, Margaret. And I should say that when I visit public radio stations, and when I was on the air all the time, I would always say that it was nice to finally see the people on the other side of the radio who were listening, and that every time I saw them, I was surprised they didn't look anything like what I thought they would look like. I thought they'd all be taller and have more hair than they do. But you know, it's an education every time we meet the audience. It's delightful to be here, and WBUR is very lucky and blessed to have Margaret running the place. David Gergen is an illustration of the old adage that 2/3 of the world's surface is covered with water, and 1/3 by former All Things Considered commentators. David was one of them. And in fact, in 1984, you may recall, at the Republican convention in Dallas, I was the news director of NPR, and we were so broke I decided I should produce our coverage myself. You were our color man. You were interpreting it for us. And I remember on the night when they only had Democrats speaking, there was a man named, he was a Republican named Wendell Willkie Gunn. He was
Son?
No, he was an African-American Reagan appointee. When he was introduced, that was the only mention of a Republican who would ever run for president, because his name was Wendell Willkie Gunn. Otherwise, it was all Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Reagan. And I pointed that out to you, and you said, the new Republican Rushmore. That's what they're pushing here. You understand the Republic. You at least used to understand the Republican Party. Do you still understand the Republican Party?
I don't recognize it. Is it the Republican Party? It's Republican Party in name, mostly.
You worked in the Reagan White House. Later, you were called in, as they said, adult supervision of the Clinton White House communications operation. But Reagan bequeathed an ism to the Republican Party. It was about lower taxes, less regulation. Is there a Trump-ism that this presidency is going to leave the party? Is it is he reshaping the party in the way that Ronald Reagan did?
Well, it's me, me, me. And
Me, me.
me, me, me.
Gimme, gimme, gimme.
Gimme, gimme, gimme. That's right. It is far from a Mount Rushmore. Listen, but I do think, first of all, let me say how privileged I am to be here. I'm sorry Nick Burns hasn't joined you yet, but I'm sure, knowing Nick, he will get here. If
Actually, he's
possible.
gotten here. He'll be
is he?
joining us soon.
Is he back there?
Yeah.
Can we bring up another
Yeah.
chair?
That's right. No, but we still want to hear from you for.
No.
for a
Okay,
while.
he's going to bring some wisdom. I'll bring some humor, but he's going to
Yeah.
bring the wisdom.
You-
So,
He deserves a good opening act, don't you think? He's
absolutely.
a star.
But I'm really glad to see you here.
Yeah.
I hope you'll come back frequently. You're always welcome in Boston.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's get back to the Republicans
Let's go
for a
back.
moment.
Well, I'll tell you.
Yeah,
I'll tell you.
I mean,
I'll tell
everyone's
you.
obsessing with the Democrats this week because of the debate tomorrow night in Las Vegas, the Nevada caucuses. But the Republican Party includes people whom I've regarded all these years as fairly sensible professional legislators, people like Rob Portman of Ohio, Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri, who ran for the Senate defending his support of the TARP, which had been famously unpopular with the Republican rank and file. And I've been surprised by how quiescent the Republicans have been. Have you been surprised?
Shocked.
Shocked.
No, this is not the party of our parents or our grandparents. There's been a takeover. It hasn't been a hostile takeover, but it has been a takeover of the party by Donald Trump and his minions, which I think is historic. I think one of the big questions we don't know is, does Trumpism survive Trump?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody can tell that yet. In Virginia recently, someone tried out that theory, and it didn't seem to work very well that Trumpism would survive him. But nonetheless, I think for the present purposes, it is enormously important. And Nick will get into the foreign policy consequences and how it threatens the geopolitical stability of the world, and how increasingly I think it's threatening our own democracy, as well as democracies overseas.
You do feel that's a threat to our democracy. What's that?
Yeah. Listen, there's a whole genre of new books that have been coming out about democracies and the existential threats around the world. And the best, I think, is written by two Harvard professors, Ziblatt and Levitsky, and it's called How Democracies Die. Mm-hmm. And it makes the point short. That was one nice thing. And it's accessible. I say even more positive. But in any event, it makes the point that since the end of the Cold War, at least 12 significant democracies have elected leaders who have then taken them down an authoritarian path. Mm-hmm. We so far have, I think, not realized the worst of what might happen. Checks and balances still working reasonably well, not all, but I do think a free press. We learned it in Watergate. And now here again in this episode, a free press is one of the single most important set of checks and balances that we have. And that's why it's important to keep WBUR and other stations going, because we need some sources that are seen as speaking the truth that are credible. And right now, I'm afraid to say, increasingly newspapers are seen as opinionated. You can't tell the difference between the news and opinions. Yep. And cable news is taking it, in the head. Whether you're, people believe, well, you just represent one point of view. And full disclosure, I have a contract with CNN, so I'm partial on this question. But I do think it's been a struggle. Because one of the problems you have if you're now reporting on the Trump administration is that if you tell the truth about what you're seeing, you sound like you're a partisan. Yeah. Because the truth is ugly in many cases. And it sounds, we're reporting on things that, like, what? He did what? Almost every time. So I can't tell you how important it is to have trust in our institutions. Democracy does not depend strictly on rules. It depends upon the quality of our civic life. And that civic life it requires us to have some level of trust in the people we look up to or to whom we entrust a great deal of power, like our presidents, but also our senators, and also people who run, all the institutions in the country. Trust has plummeted. It's plummeted over the last 30 to 40 years. It started before Trump. It's accelerated under Trump, and it makes it exceedingly difficult to govern. Yeah. And so I have very great concern about the next president. Should it be a Democrat? That may give relief to a lot of people in this room, but the prospects for governing are still very, very dim. We're in a dark period now in our politics. That's not to say we won't. I think we bounce back. I happen to be a short-term pessimist, but a long-term optimist. Mm-hmm. I just wish that the long-term would get here. Damn it.
Yeah. But let me ask you about one word that you've used. Let me ask you about one complicated word that you've used. Us.
Yes.
We.
Yes.
Who are we? Who's us? Do we all feel that need for democratic leadership, or are there many of our countrymen and women who would prefer to say, I want somebody who talks plain and simple and makes good on the ideas, however dumb they may be, but pursues them, and who is not a fake. He's no fake civility.
Well, it's like that George Allen line, sincerity. If you can fake that, you've got it made.
You got it made. Who said that?
I think it was.
I think Dan Shore used to say he heard that at CBS, that was the advice he got. If you can fake sincerity, you've got it made.
Yeah, exactly right. Listen, I think there is a portion of the country that's still quite civil, believes in civil discourse, feels. And I must tell you, I think there are a number of people who in the past have identified with the Republican Party who are looking to see if they can find a candidate in the Democratic Party they can support this next time. And what has been concerning is that the Democrats tear into each other. It's making it harder and harder to find somebody they would like to have govern them, and they will turn back to Trump if that remains the case. Yeah. And that is one danger we have to be, I think, aware of.
I should say, as someone who grew up in New York City, I see Mike Bloomberg campaign, and he reminds me of the ideal candidate of a party that doesn't exist anymore, which was the Rockefeller Republican Party.
I totally agree.
He represents all of the attributes of the Rockefeller Republicans.
He's a little more conservative than Nelson Rockefeller on some issues, but I think on climate change and on guns in particular. But I happen to be a Bloomberg fan in the sense that going through New York, on a regular basis, one saw the changes that took place during his regime. There were a lot of things that weren't positive that you would have to object to, but overall, as American leadership goes these days, he's pretty darn good by the standards of today.
Isn't it remarkable? And I ask you because you've been involved in the relationship between media and the presidency from both sides twice, in different parties even. 4 years ago, we were all obsessing over social media and how someone could get elected spending hardly anything on commercials.
Right.
Now we're watching the biggest buy of commercial airtime that anyone has ever seen at this phase of the presidential selection, and it looks like it can get you already 10 to 15% of the Democratic vote.
Trump is, Bloomberg's up to 19%, I think, the latest polls. No, I think that's right. But in some ways, obviously, we all share the view you shouldn't be able to pour that much kind of money into an election and win the election. That there's something inherently just uncomfortable, if not wrong, about that. I must say, in extraordinary times, sometimes extraordinary measures are needed. Extraordinary countermeasures are needed. And if the price of getting a really good president, an ethical president, a president gets things done, is the fact that he spent a lot of his wealth on getting there, that's a price I'm willing to pay.
Seems there are some others here who have the same price in mind.
Well,
just one other point before we invite Nick up.
Yeah.
That is about the state of the media. You said that nowadays, and I agree with you, a lot of the standards that we used to think existed between news reporting and news analysis or opinion pieces, the boundary seems to have, the bold line has become a dotted line, or a
Yes.
fuzzy dotted line.
I know.
And are you worried about the state of the media? And I should also say that the bright spot of the media has been very aggressive reporting on the Trump presidency.
I agree with that.
Done by about 2.5 newspapers.
I agree with that. The Washington Post versus the New York Times, that rivalry has produced great journalism.
That's it, and that's
Yeah.
it. Should we be worried about this?
We ought to be worried about some things, but look, I'm a lot more optimistic about the future of the press and the future of the media than I am about the future of governance. Our real problems, the crisis we have today increasingly is one of governance and lack of trust and the declining standards, deterioration in the rhetoric and the respect we show each other, the trust we have in each other. But I do think there's some things, and you put your finger on one of the single most important things going on today, and the degree to which the press is exercising the checks and balances and holding this administration accountable. We would not know a lot of this had it not been for really good press journalism. I also think, though, in the long term, as much as there are dangers, Margaret talked about what's happening in communities across the country with the loss of newspapers. That is, I think that it has been a really serious problem, and one of the reasons that we see the flyover territory, the Kentuckys and the West Virginias of the world, or read Nick Kristof and Cheryl Wu Dunn's new book called Tightrope, about what's happening with the white middle class back in Oregon, where he went to school when he grew up on a farm out there. He went every day by a school bus to school, and the 40, 50 kids, a quarter of them are now dead from opioids and alcohol and loneliness and that sort of thing. So we have, not having a sense of a vibrant community with its own newspaper, I think, is a loss for the country. Robert, but there's another loss that you would know so much more about, and that is, and Nick would too, so many news organizations have cut back on their international reporting. And on cable, we don't, it's hard to find the news of the world in many places. I've known when...
But your network, CNN, actually has an international...
It has an international...
Where
I think
many of its reporters
job.
get their stories on the air, but they don't get them on the domestic channel.
No, it's been a struggle because there's so much Trump news that has blocked it out. But I do think that, when Al Jazeera was sort of running there in this country, I had two major foreign policy authorities in this country. Two of the most highly respected men in the country told me, you know where I got my international news? Al Jazeera.
Was Colin Powell one of them?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. He said you can't look at it for its Middle East, but once you get past the Middle East, you really learn the real story. And I do think, we're going through an aberrational period of thinking we can pull back and be just a nation with walls around it. The globalism is here to stay, and we need to raise kids who have traveled the world, but also hear the news about the world on a regular basis. So I worry about that a lot. But I want to finish on just the optimistic tone here. Jim Lehrer was a dear friend, and my wife Ann, who's here, and I had dinner with Jim and Kate about a week before he died. He was here in Boston, and we had dinner over at the Liberty Hotel, and he just was the standard about news versus opinion. He was so committed to not being partial as a newscaster that he didn't even vote. He wanted to be able to maintain his neutrality. He thought that was critical. And I think if we go back to those standards, there's going to be a place for newspapers and radio and television to flourish again. It's not going to be the same. It won't have the social media is here to stay, and it is totally. I think it's a sewage line sometimes. A lot of things it does right, but I think it's been net destructive in the last few years. But I do feel that as long as we have standards and we have people like Robert Siegel and Jim Lehrer who can help us remember what news reporting is supposed to be like, what programs are supposed to be, I think we'll get back there. I think this is an aberrational period. It's dark, to be sure, but I have more faith. I frankly have more faith in the people in the private sector getting things back on track than I do the government right now, than our politicians. I mean, the fact that Jeff Bezos could put $10 billion into climate change is really encouraging.
Yeah.
You know, we ought to be saying back, wow, look at that. That really makes a difference.
David Gergen, thank you for the
Thank you
long-term
very much.
optimism.
Okay.
It's great to see you.
Good
It's
to
wonderful
see you.
to see you.
Okay,
Thank
I'm
you.
going to give it to you.
You can,
Next turn.
here. Don't take the mic, though. David? Hi. Thank you, David Gergen. And welcome, Ambassador Professor Burns. How are you? Good to see you. Nice to see you. It's been a long time, yes.
Welcome to Boston.
Thank you very much. And I gather you had a pretty fast welcome to Boston. Welcome back to Boston this evening. But,
2 canceled flights, but I made it.
so I
To
should say...
support WBUR.
Here. Oh, good. I'm glad you're I should say I find it intriguing that not only did Nick Burns retire as Undersecretary for Political Affairs, you were the highest-ranking career Foreign Service officer, or some would say the most successful Mandarin of the administrative state.
The deep state.
Deep state.
The swamp,
Well, I was gonna
Donald Trump would say.
You're now teaching at Deep State U, like Gergen, but you began as an intern at the U.S. Embassy before you became a Foreign Service officer in Mauritania, the cap which is Nouakchott.
Nouakchott.
Did they make you find that on a map? Did they have
did.
a map
Test.
without names on it that they made you point at?
I had actually focused on African studies at Johns Hopkins, the graduate school. Yeah, that was the start, 1980, a long time ago, 40 years ago. I grew up here outside of Boston in Wellesley, went to Boston College. So this is, Libby and I, my wife and I, she's also from here, left for 30 years.
Wow.
We've come back. But that was our start. We'd been to Europe as students, but we'd never been to Africa, and to be in the Sahara Desert. In 1980, Mauritania was 20 years past colonialism.
Yeah.
They'd just become independent. It was desperately poor. It was the last nomadic society on earth. Until the mid-70s, the majority of the people were nomads. And there was a horrible, horrible drought. And for the first time in the history of these people, there was food aid from the United Nations. So a lot of them came in, lost their way of life just as we were arriving, and were really living penniless on international food aid. It was very tragic. Big country, and you can also see back then, Robert, that was the summer of the Iran-Iraq war.
Yes.
And the summer after our hostages had been taken, they were still being held. There was a terrific struggle between the Iraqis and the Saudis to build mosques, to have influence in the Muslim world. People, of course, they need mosques, but they didn't need as many mosques as were built. They needed food more than anything else. So it was a great learning experience.
So you saw the whole story of civilization in one internship when you were a young man.
I had never lived in a Muslim society before. And so, I read, but I made a lot of friends there and learned a lot about Islam and what Muslims believe, and grew to really respect that religion and its people.
Let me ask you about, all of us all around the world during the impeachment hearings got a glimpse of career diplomats, country experts, political appointees, experienced political appointees, inexperienced political appointees, their interactions with the president, national security advisor. As you were watching, I assume you followed this.
Every minute of it.
Did you recognize it? Were there moments of great familiarity to you, or was this a different planet you were seeing described?
Well, all these people who testified, these were all Foreign Service officers. And so we are nonpartisan, resolutely. We serve both parties. We take an oath of nonpartisanship. They were subpoenaed.
Yeah.
And I was proud that each of them decided that, contrary to the wishes of the State Department, which forbade them from testifying, they would honor their oath to the Constitution. And because, Americans, when we serve in government, we take an oath not to the president. We take an oath to the Constitution, to the rule of law. And these are all friends of mine. Masha Yovanovitch, close friend. Bill Taylor, close friend. George Kent from Cambridge, Mass, grew up here.
Mm-hmm.
Went to Harvard College. George was the youngest person who testified. And if there was a silver lining, Robert, in a really dark autumn and early January in the impeachment inquiry, for me it was the Foreign Service officers, because as you say, people got a sense There are people in Washington who are intensely patriotic, not partisan, don't yell and scream at the other person across the table, and who are intelligent and want to serve and do serve the country. A lot of people commented to me who didn't know the Foreign Service, gee, you really
They're
have
pretty
good people.
impressive.
They're impressive.
Yeah, pretty
And
impressive
they were
group.
impressive.
Yeah.
They were. And we're bringing most of them to Harvard for our public service week.
Yeah. Deep State U, as I said.
Deep State U.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But did you recall disputes over presidential phone calls? Were these things that happened when you were at State? Was there anything comparable to this in your time?
No, nothing comparable. We're in uncharted territory. I worked for every president from Jimmy Carter to George W. Bush, then I was an advisor to John Kerry and the Obama administration on his advisory board, and every single one of those presidents, from Jimmy Carter to Barack Obama and all of them in between, both parties. You can argue with their policies, domestic or foreign, but they were honorable people, and they were honest people. And I can say, I think every one of them put the country first.
Yep.
And made tough decisions. And I'm sorry to be so political, and if there are Trump supporters here, I don't want to be disrespectful, but we have to tell the truth. The current president is a dishonest person. He doesn't tell the truth. And I wanted to join David and you in honoring your profession. The First Amendment's pretty important to the functioning of a society, the free press, and to see the press demonized,
Yep.
to see us divided by race, by someone who preys on divisions. We've never had a president, I think, in the history of the country who has ruled by dividing us,
Yep.
and our greatest leaders have tried to unite us.
It's a lot harder to put over a lie, let's say, on the American public when it's about things that they're experiencing in their everyday lives here in the country. When it's about what kind of country Ukraine is, or whether the Allies are anteing up in NATO, we're getting into territory where even if the news media did a very good job of truth squatting every claim made, they probably wouldn't be in articles that the majority of Americans would read. So let me ask you: you're just back from Europe, for example, with our parsimonious so-called allies, as I think the president would probably have it.
That's what he'd say.
What are our relations like with our NATO allies?
Well,
You were once ambassador to NATO, I should say.
I was, yeah. I was ambassador. I was also ambassador to Greece, so I know
To
Europe
Greece as well. Yeah.
And I think that I was at the Munich Security Conference. I should start there. And the Munich Security Conference is the most important conference for government leaders in the world. It's been 56 years. It's if Davos is the great business conference, middle of February is the great political conference. And President Macron spoke. Mike Pompeo spoke, our Secretary of State. Mark Esper, our Secretary of Defense. Nancy Pelosi was there. She spoke. There were 48 members of Congress. And I must say, I've been going to this conference since 1995. We have never been so divided from our allies as we are right now.
What are the dividing lines? What are the divisions?
The dividing lines are that the number one issue in Europe right now among the population of 500 million Europeans is climate change. Mm-hmm. They feel it deeply. There are 195 states in the world. One of them has walked out on everybody. That's the United States. Second, France, Britain, and Germany were our partners for 10 years in trying to get to the Iran nuclear deal. We walked out of that. Third, there are 69 million refugees and internally displaced people in the world today, the greatest number, the largest number since 1945 when the world was blown apart. And the Europeans, the Germans have taken in 800,000 refugees, and the Swedes have taken in 200,000 refugees. And the United States, I think, took in 19,000 refugees last year. We're infinitely larger. We're a refugee nation. Einstein, Kissinger, Madeleine Albright, all refugees. But the president announced proudly in December of 2019, just 2 months ago, for the first time, I think, in over 60 years, we did not take in a single refugee. So we're divided by all these issues that they care about. And the big thing, Robert, is this. The United States and the American president are the leaders of NATO and have been since it was formed in Harry Truman's time 71 years ago. Donald Trump is at best ambivalent at NATO on his good days, and on most days he's intensely critical. And then, of course, the European Union was formed after the Second World War to bring France and Germany together so they would never fight again. Every American president encouraged that, thought of the EU as a leader, and our president said last week, The European Union was created to harm the United States, which is ahistorical, untrue, a lie. But this was all on the stage last week. And so when President Macron spoke, when the President Frank-Walter Steinmeier of Germany spoke, they raised these issues.
Yeah.
And their message essentially was, what happened to you guys and gals? You know, we were just a couple of years ago blood brothers, and now you've essentially forsaken us. It was a bittersweet weekend for all of us.
Well, let me ask you this question. Do you think it's possible that the changes that Donald Trump brought to questions like Iran and the nuclear deal, or Europe, he takes a very transactional view of our whole relationship with our NATO allies, do you think it's possible that a country fairly tired of very long wars that we've been involved with since the beginning of this century would sustain those policies and would support their furtherance? Or do you think this is an odd disruption, an odd detour from what is the natural course of U.S. policy?
I think it's an odd detour.
An odd detour.
If you look at public opinion, 75% of Americans in the latest Chicago Council poll say they support NATO, and they support the European Union. And if you poll all those Republican senators you were talking about, from Mitch McConnell to Rob Portman to Mitt Romney to Marco Rubio, they all support NATO. The president has different views. But I would just separate two issues. We should be tired of the two land wars. Iraq and Afghanistan. They're the two longest wars in the history of the United States. We've lost 4,500 men and women killed in Iraq. We've well over 35,000 wounded. I think those are the numbers. And we've lost about 2,500 men and women in Afghanistan. We just lost 2 soldiers tragically just last week. We have paid the price in both places, and so we need to find a way out of both of them. And let me try to say something good about President Trump. He is trying to negotiate right now some kind of a ceasefire arrangement with the Taliban that would allow us at least to draw down our forces and perhaps at some point get out of Afghanistan. So I think he's right about that, and I think President Obama was right about that. He didn't want to stay either. But I'd separate that from the bigger question, Robert, should we be active in the world? Should we be working with other countries in the world on pandemics like the coronavirus, or on climate change? Of course we should. And should we have a military alliance called NATO, not to fight to prevent war and to contain the Russians? I think we probably agree on that answer.
Yeah. Although, you know, I'm thinking back to the air campaign against Libya. And I remember interviewing, I think it was a Brit, but my memory fails me. And I wondered, well, how is it? This was a case, I think President Obama, maybe I've imagined this quote, but I seem to recall him saying, we can't always ask our European allies to join us in Iraq, join us in Afghanistan, and when they are really urgent about something, for us to then say, no, I'm sorry, we can't do it. Libya is really important to them. And by the time the U.S. had entered Libya, all the leaders to whom it had been so important had been voted out of office in Europe. I think Sarkozy, whoever it was gone. And I remember asking about the U.S. role in that, and it was explained to me that NATO is constructed in such a way that our allies, even with a relatively local problem in their part of the world, cannot act militarily without us. That they need us at the core of the command and control system. Does that make sense? I mean, do we want to have that control over the alliance, or do we want to see the French and the Germans be able to deal with a local problem locally?
Well, we want the European allies to be able to do more. And President Obama was deeply skeptical about getting into Libya in 2011. President Obama had run in 2008 on an anti-war platform. And he didn't want to get us entangled again, but the reality was, as you correctly recall, that the British and French couldn't sustain air operations for very long without the really air support, munitions, and intelligence support from the United States. But let me just make 2 quick points, because you're asking a really profound question. Should we want to have friends in the world? Look, I'm with President Trump. Germany, France, Spain, Italy should pay more for their defense. In NATO, we say you should pay at least 2% of your GDP. It should be your national defense budget. The problem with President Trump is he's not reading what the trend lines are.
Yep.
Since Putin invaded Crimea in 2014, there have been real defense budget increases in every single one of the NATO allies. So the trend line's up. It began under President Obama. It's continuing under President Trump. I think President Trump should congratulate President Obama and congratulate himself and say both of us have done this because they've both done it. But
You and David Gergen are both long-term optimists.
we are.
Yes, you're very, very long-term optimists.
But quick story. Quick story. When President Trump complains about the Allies, what have they done for us? We do all the work. I tell people about my 9/11 story. I was a new ambassador in Brussels in NATO. I'd been there for 12 days. We were hit really hard, as you remember well.
I
All
was
of
in
us
New
do
York,
in
yes,
New York
I was
and
there.
Washington, 3,000 people dead. I couldn't reach the State Department, White House, and Defense Department because they'd been evacuated in the hours after the attacks. My phone started ringing. The Canadian ambassador, David Wright, the German ambassador, Gebhard von Moltke, the French ambassador, Benoit d'Aboville. We're with you. We want to support you. Was it Al-Qaeda? Was it bin Laden? We'll go to war with you. And by that evening, every single one of the NATO allies under our Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, an attack on one of us shall be considered an attack on all of us, had come forward to me at NATO to say, we're with you. And I never forget, I called Condoleezza Rice the next morning. She was then the National Security Advisor. And I said, Condi, the allies want to invoke Article 5. And she said, go for it. I said, thank you, but I think I need the president's personal instruction. We're going to go to war.
Yeah.
She said, go for it.
Yeah.
And then I tried a third time. She cut me off. She said, look, Nick, the president's had a really bad day. Go for it. But then she said something that I've never forgotten. I said, I'm going to go down and we're going to vote and we're going to go to war against bin Laden. She said one more thing. I said, what's that? She said, it's good to have friends in the world.
Yeah.
Why would we want to be alone in the world?
Yeah.
Those Europeans are still there with us 19 years later. They all have troops in Afghanistan. They've suffered 1,000 combat deaths, several thousand wounded, and when Donald Trump criticizes them, he doesn't know his history. He wants to dig a moat around the country, build walls, pull up drawbridges, perfect for 1620, 1720, 1820. 2020?
Not.
Coronavirus, global economy, pandemics, climate change. We need friends.
Yep.
That's what's at stake in the Trump argument versus the Biden, Bloomberg, Elizabeth Warren argument on the other side. Those three people, and Amy Klobuchar and others, they believe in American leadership, and President Trump really doesn't. He's a unilateralist. He doesn't want to be with anybody.
Yeah. But before we take questions from the audience, which I think we should do pretty soon, I wanted to ask, you mentioned Crimea a moment ago. Russia made two moves on Ukraine. One of them off in the east, in Donetsk, where I went as a reporter a zillion years ago, and one in Crimea, where I've never been, but where I know that Nikita Khrushchev, as I think a 300th birthday present to Ukraine, gave it from Russia to Ukraine during the Soviet period.
When they were both republics.
When they were both republics, and when the Soviet Union had asserted an odd status for Ukraine as one of the founding republics of the Soviet Union. They had their own ambassador, to their own mission to the United Nations.
They did.
Yeah. And Belarusia too. They had three Soviet
Stalin who insisted
exactly.
on that.
Stalin got something to equal some Latin American countries by doing that. Yeah. But Crimea, became part of Ukraine in one of those Soviet acts that we don't regard as being especially democratic or mindful of history. What do we do? I mean, will the United States tacitly concede the point on Crimea? Will it be like a captive nation that will not impede our dealings with Moscow, but will never send a diplomat from the Russian embassy there? What do you do with that?
You know, it's an important principle. When Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were really thinking about the United Nations, Churchill, they had in mind a peace treaty and an organization that would protect countries, smaller countries from larger ones. Hitler had gone into the Sudetenland and the Rhineland and Austria and the rest. And Stalin had taken over the Baltic states and part of Poland. And they were determined, FDR and his successors, to have a United Nations and international law that would protect smaller countries from that kind of annexation. It held from 1945 to 2014. No big state in Europe took someone else's territory and said, it's mine now, until March 2014, when Putin did it. The principle's really important because if you give way to the Russians, if you give them a pass or an exception or lift the sanctions, Putin's an acquisitive guy. He's also very intelligent, and he's a KGB guy.
Yeah.
He's going to keep going until you erect the brick wall of the rule of law. So my view is we should contain him, and we should never lift the sanctions. And Angela Merkel doesn't want to lift the sanctions as long as she's Chancellor of Germany. I worry about President Trump. He seems obsessed with Putin and seems to want to make deals, and this could be one of the deals he makes.
But if he were here right now, he would say, yeah, but Angela Merkel, she wants all that gas from Russia, meanwhile. I mean, she wants us to maintain sanctions, but she wants what she can do, what her country could use from Russia at the same time.
Well, so this is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. It's a big mistake, and I'm opposed to it. But it's not illegal.
Yeah.
It doesn't flout international law. Taking Crimea and annexing it, making it part of the Russian Federation, that's illegal.
What I'm saying is the Germans seem to be, at least at this point, invested in that much of a relationship with Russia, despite whatever they might join in the way of sanctions against Russia.
Yeah, politics is complicated.
Politics is complicated. Okay.
It is.
Good
You're
answer.
right.
That's an honest answer.
Yeah.
Nicholas Burns, who was, after his internship in Mauritania, went on later to be ambassador to Greece, as you said, to the EU, and also Undersecretary for Diplomatic Affairs. If you have a question about anything in U.S. foreign policy, this is the guy.
It's like Jeopardy, then. Question on anything.
That's right.
Why
Any
did
category.
the Red Sox trade Mookie Betts? Are you
Well, you know,
are you a Yankees fan?
I knew. I was thinking of
I
mentioning
suspect you're
Mookie
a
Betts.
Yankees fan.
No, I'm not. I'm an apostate Yankees fan. I was.
This is Red Sox.
I
You're
was
the
a Yankee
harder
fan
Red
from
Sox.
the age of 5, and somewhere in the, I'll say, the Clemens, Rodriguez, Jambi era, I lost the faith and even developed a fondness for the Boston Red Sox.
Thank you.
I did.
You're a popular person in Boston.
But I don't.
It's our local religion, so.
But I gather that right now, Mr. Henry has explained or tried to explain the trading away of Mookie Betts.
This young man
Yes.
was probably one of the 4 or 5 greatest players in the history of the Red Sox.
Yes.
He was a really positive force in our community. I'll never forget in the recent World Series, after one of the games, at midnight, he took meals to the homeless.
No.
He was a positive force, and we traded him away for nothing. I'm opposed to the trade.
I think we've finally gotten to the bone here. We really got it.
Really
he also is, I
important
believe,
things.
the best bowler in Major League Baseball.
He's a great bowler.
Great
actually.
bowler. He's
He is.
a
He is. He
professional
really is.
level bowler.
He is.
And was named Mookie, I think, for the Mets outfielder, for Mookie. Why am I forgetting
No,
his
but
last
don't talk about that.
I'm sorry.
Because that gets us back to October 26,
Yes, he was in that game.
1986, when
He
we
was
lost the
in
6th
the,
game against the Mets.
Bill Buckner game. So whether you're interested in perhaps the history of the Red Sox or the new curse of the Mook that will now be invoked by Red Sox fans, or about matters of U.S. foreign policy, now's your chance to put a question to this extremely knowledgeable man. I see somebody. I can barely see you, so I see someone over here raising hand.
Get your thoughts on what is going to happen with Brexit, which we know is going to come crashing out of the European Union, and how that's going to affect not only the balance of power in Europe, but our relationship with Great Britain and Europe, and how that's all going to, just your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there are going to be 3 big impacts. This is very serious. Number one, there's going to be a big impact on the European Union that Britain is leaving, because Britain was the 2nd largest economy, strongest military, and certainly the most globally minded of the European countries. So the EU is going to be weaker. Secondly, the United States is going to be weaker, because Britain's been our closest ally. There's real trust. And I remember when I was undersecretary, I had problems with the French and Germans, the Italians. I would call my British counterpart, John Soares. I'd say, John, I'm striking out with the French. Can you be the intermediary? And they invariably were, for American presidents as well as people like me. So that's going to be a loss for the United States. We're going to have to deepen our relationship with the Germans and French. And the president's not doing a great job of it so far. Third, and most importantly, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland was assembled by the Act of Union in 1707. Remember that name, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I think within 5 years, the Scots will hold a referendum.
For independence.
The Scots. And likely secede. There are 5 million Scots that are very pro-EU. And here's the thing about Massachusetts. This is the capital of Irish America. 50% of the residents of this state in the last census claim some measure of Irish ancestry. I'm 100% Irish, 2 Irish grandparents, and that's not unusual. So here's what's going to happen in Ireland. Ireland, the Republic, is now much stronger economically than the United Kingdom, as well as Northern Ireland in terms of per capita income. Ireland's an incredible success, intensely pro-EU. Catholics' population rate in Northern Ireland vastly exceeds the Protestant birth rate. And the Protestants in Northern Ireland are pro-EU. They voted against Brexit. A lot of smart people in the UK think that Northern Ireland is going to melt into the Republic of Ireland, and we'll have a united Ireland within the next 10 years. And, you know, growing up Irish American in this region, I never would have thought that there was a chance of that. It's just, so they're going to be
The first step to that
impacts.
being that Brexit, in effect, puts the border in the sea. I mean,
It does. It puts the border in the Irish Sea, and this is complicated, but Northern Ireland is left in the EU customs union. So Northern Ireland's a member of, is part of the United Kingdom, but it's the only part that's in the customs union. Trade, investment, and demography, and population rates, and religion are going to make Ireland united. An incredible thing. And if you're Irish American, or if you love Ireland, it's almost a miracle after 700 years of Britain's colonization of the Irish.
well, you know, if the Scots were to leave, the
We're
Union,
getting ready for St. Patrick's Day.
the Union Jack, the Union flag, people often don't get, is a superimposition of the crosses of the various
Yes.
parts of the kingdom. And if
Of
the
Ireland, Wales, and
cross
Scotland.
of St. Andrew goes off,
It does.
and you know, it could be a different flag. For
It's tragic for Britain
yeah.
to see the country splinter like this.
Let's get a question from.
Hello?
Yes, well,
First, Mr. Siegel, thank you so much for coming here and allowing us to put your voice to a body. And Ambassador Burns.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't.
No, it was attached to the body before I came to Boston. But go ahead, it's all right. But I understand.
Ambassador Burns, a message received that you did not mention Bernie Sanders in your list of
I did not.
candidates.
No, I did not.
I am not revealing my allegiance.
Hey, Joe.
Actually, I'm here neutrally, but it does make me wonder if the deep state is, in fact, as rumors are, that they are making sure that Sanders will not be a nominee.
You don't really believe we have a deep state, do you? That's a figment of Steve Bannon and Donald Trump's imagination. No, seriously, of all the Democrats, I'm going to be very transparent. I am advising Joe Biden. I've been on his campaign for 13 months. I think he's the best person to be president. He's got a very tough series of tests in Nevada and South Carolina, but he's not over yet. But let's get to your question. I think of all the Democrats running, all of them believe that the United States should interact with the rest of the world, should be trading, should have alliances, should be supporting democracy, should be opposing Russia. I would respectfully say, if you're a Bernie Sanders supporter, I mean, there's a lot of reasons you might want to vote for him, but foreign policy shouldn't be one of them, at least in my judgment. When we had to put sanctions on Russia for their cyber attack on our 2016 election, the Senate voted 98-2 to impose sanctions in 2017. There were 2 senators who voted against sanctioning Russia. One was Rand Paul, who's the biggest isolationist in the Senate on the right, and the other was Bernie Sanders. And frankly, I think he is an isolationist, Senator Sanders. I think we would decline as a global power under his leadership, and I just don't support him. But obviously you have a right to, and this is what elections are all about, and we'll see who wins.
Okay, whoever has the microphone can tell us who is going to speak next. Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
You got that? Okay. Thank you. And first of all, this is just a delightful evening to have you two here. And all I can say is that hearing Robert Siegel is magnificent. And
Seeing him too, right?
and seeing him, right? Well, it's true. It's never happened before. So my question is, in international relationships. So von Clausewitz said, the fog of war. What about the fog of peace? So how do you negotiate your way through all the minefields when you're not in direct confrontation with your allies and adversaries?
What a beautiful question. We could organize an entire course at BU or BC or Harvard on that question. It's a good question. Diplomacy is complicated. You know, the military gets a lot and should get a lot of attention and support because it's so important to us. But actually about 90% of global affairs is not fighting, it's talking. And sometimes we're able to talk to really good friends. We're so fortunate to be bordered by Canada and Mexico. Of all the big countries in the world, we have the two best neighbors. They don't want to kill us. They want to trade with us. They may be frustrated with us, but they want to live with us. So that's number one. We have allies. Our allies are the great power differential. The United States has 28 allies in NATO. Russia, no allies. China, no allies. The United States has Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Thailand, allies. I mean, if we didn't have these allies, we'd want to run out and create them to be able to do good things in the world, advance our interests. So that's what diplomacy is too. You run those alliances. The really difficult part is when you have an adversary. I wouldn't use the word enemy because enemy is very specific. We're in a fight. And there's no one in the world today we're about to fight. But we have no diplomatic relationship with Iran. We have no diplomatic relationship to speak of with North Korea. And North Korea has nuclear weapons. Iran wants to get them. Iran's a violent force for the worse in the Middle East. So how do you communicate? Yep. You send signals. Yep. In the case of Iran, when we attacked Soleimani and killed him, and then when the Iranians struck back, you know how they communicated with us? They communicated through the Swiss. The Swiss have been our protecting power between us for 40 years. A letter came from Tehran, the foreign ministry, to the Swiss foreign ministry in Bern, to the Swiss embassy. This took 2 minutes. The Swiss embassy in Washington, and the Swiss ambassador brought it over to my friend David Hale in the State Department and said, here's the Iranian response. And we know from the New York Times that the Iranian response said, we've just struck your air base. We don't want anything else, i.e., don't hit us and end the fighting. Diplomacy works in very strange ways, but Yitzhak Rabin said, you don't negotiate on matters of war and peace with your best friends. You negotiate with, he said, very unsavory enemies. He was thinking of shaking Arafat's hand. Yeah. So what the United States has to do is practice that diplomacy. And we have to be smart enough to stay out of wars and to read the tea leaves and the signals right. And that's talk. That's having intelligent people working in the State Department and the White House like George Kent and Masha Yovanovitch. And boy, do we need those diplomats.
Yeah. I would just add one thing, by the way, I like the phrase, the fog of peace. A little over 40 years ago, I was sent to London to be based out of Bush House, which was then headquarters of the BBC External Services, to effectively begin NPR's foreign coverage. I was the beginning of this. And I had went over, like a lot of reporters, hoping to be able to report about this thing, the common market, the European communities, whatever it was called. It was present. My wife, who was here, actually took a degree at the LSE in European integration as long as we were there. And when I came to this conclusion, America had seen the common market, as it had been, through British eyes, through the lens of Britain, our closest allies. And if you saw European integration through British eyes, you saw a very cranky, difficult, contested relationship, which should be about a customs union, and little distractions keep on getting thrown into it. If you went to the continent, you saw a peace movement that was designed to prevent the next World War, which we've gotten through 70 years without one, which is without a European continental war. And I always felt that it was, I would call that a case of fog of peace, which was, there was never any news that I could convince an editor was very important. Margaret Thatcher is negotiating over the EU budget, the EC budget as it was then. With
they weren't
the
interested.
Dull stuff. I'm just boring. My eyes glaze over. But meanwhile, what was happening in Europe was a great belief in a new way of dealing among nations that would be a substitute for having another continental war, which had been the European way.
Well, there's the answer to Donald Trump. He thinks the EU was formed to harm us. Yeah. Well, we had 2 million American soldiers in France in 1918. We had 16 million Americans in uniform in 1943, 44, 45. We don't have to do that anymore because the Europeans aren't fighting. In fact, they're allied with us. So there's another reason for NATO.
Yes. Now, I don't know how much time we have of Nick's, because I realize
Robert, let's do one more question.
we have 3 hours of Nick. That's it. Let's do question. You're happy to do more than one question? Nick's happy to do more than one question. Okay. We'll do more than one question.
Professor Burns, I'm Lawrence Clifford. 2 months ago, I asked you a question at LaSalle College about your colleague Graham Allison's book. I'm going to change the question now. I didn't tell you then. I'm a Soviet and Imperial Russian historian. And you just talked about getting along. Well, we didn't do a very good job in 1989, and we created Putin. The Russians did not like the chaos of what happened to them. They were on their bellies. And we did very little to help them during those days. It was in those days that I was finishing my PhD at BC under Roberta Manning. And I just wonder if we really understand the Russians. I don't know any Russians or any people that live in the Donetsk Basin in the Ukraine that don't think they're Russian. They think they're Russians. And so, you know, Peter the Great would roll over in his grave if he thought the Ukraine, remember, it used to be known as Kiev Rus.
Yes. Kiev and Rus a long, long time ago.
I understand.
To be
the
fair.
fact of the matter is,
1,000 years
that's
ago.
where its history
1,000 years
comes
ago.
from.
Well, let's hear Nick Burns' answer.
Well, what we have in common is Boston College. What we don't have
Mookie
in
Betts,
common,
probably. Yes.
Mookie Betts. I think, you know, with
He's a
great-
Yankee fan.
This is a longer conversation we should have. I'll just be very brief and say I was working for George H.W. Bush at the White House when the Soviet Union fell and splintered into 15 pieces, and I stayed 5 years, worked for President Clinton. So I saw them, what they did. President Bush and President Clinton worked tirelessly to help Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. Billions of dollars of American economic assistance, tens of billions of dollars of IMF and World Bank loans. We gave Russia every chance to succeed. Yeltsin's policies of privatization created 19 oligarchs and impoverished the country. There was hyperinflation by 1996 or 7, and Yeltsin tragically descended into alcoholism, which is why he had to leave power and handed over to this young man, his intelligence advisor, National Security Advisor Vladimir Putin. The United States was not responsible for the fall of Russian democracy. We tried everything we could to normalize relations with them, and it's their responsibility. One more point. When the Soviet Union split into those 15 parts, the Russian Federation agreed that all those other peoples, the Armenians and the Azeris and the Georgians and Ukrainians and Balts, could live in peace and they wouldn't invade again. And our obligation is to uphold international law to try to protect them. That's why we're supporting Ukraine. That's why the Baltic states are in NATO. I like our story better than Putin's story.
Ukraine at the time had about 1,500 nuclear warheads on its soil, I believe.
Yeah, and a remarkable thing,
and
Robert,
surrendered
remember
them.
this.
Yes.
The United States went around to Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. There were nuclear weapons in all three of those republics when they became independent states, and we said, please give those nuclear weapons back to Russia.
Yeah.
Another way we supported Russia, because we thought it would be destabilizing and would enhance the probability of someone using a nuclear weapon if they were in these republics, and we thought it was better to have them in the Russian Federation.
And before we take your question, I just will recommend something. The best explanation to me of Russian discontent post-breakup was the documentary about the Russian hockey team called Red Army, whatever, and Fedosov, who came to the Detroit Red Wings and was the best, who then went back to be a minister of sport for Putin, and about order and pride and disorder and all that. And I thought it was a brilliant job. Hi, you have a question.
Professor Bauer.
So
My friend Joe Bauer.
Nick, I tend to look at things through an economic lens. And you've pointed out that the really fundamental questions have to do with the environment, with health, with education, and that's really underneath the political problems. That it turns out that when you look at those problems, almost every solution is regressive. That is, it's not going to change the GDP, but it will change the income of the lower part of most populations. So if you want to deal with healthcare, we can get rid of a lot of cost, but it turns out, well, it seems to me that globally, the political problem we're dealing with is that the people who would be hurt are revolting, and they are expressing distrust with brilliant leaders who know how to solve problems of the environment and health and education. How does that work out?
So I think you're right. If you look at the Trump vote, look at Brexit, look at the rise of the far-right populists in places like Hungary and Poland, these are places, and look at the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland, or just in Germany, the right-wing party in Germany. It's built on grievance politics, but legitimate grievances. The gross inequality of income. When I was growing up here in the Boston area in the 60s and 70s, we had a progressive tax system. In my hometown, which was a rather wealthy town, we were middle class, but there wasn't a huge gap, as I remember. But there is a huge gap now when Michael Bloomberg can spend $300 million on TV ads in 3 weeks. Or Donald Trump can have a couple of big, or any candidate to be fair, can have a couple of big donors because of Citizens United. This is a real problem. And obviously we need a stronger safety net in the United States. I mean, if you compare us to other industrialized societies, our health care, our welfare payments to the poor are not what they should be in this society. And I'm not supporting Senator Warren, but I really have respect for her. And I have respect for what she's trying to say, that this is a big issue. And I think all the Democratic issues, including Senator Sanders, are addressing this issue. And it ought to be a big issue in the campaign in 2020. I thought you were going to say that there are a lot of positive trend lines in the world. I thought that's where you were starting. So before we end...
The questioner is shaking his head, no, I shouldn't.
I would just say, Robert, before we end, in discussions like this, we end up by depressing everybody because, the world is awash in problems. So at the end of every semester, I ask my class, and I have usually 15 to 20 different nationalities in a Harvard Graduate School class. At the Kennedy School, I say, what are you hopeful about? Not what you wish for, but analytically, where are the positive trend lines that we can push forward as a human race? And my students invariably, there's top 4. Poverty alleviation. 1 billion people lifted out of poverty since 1980. It's the greatest alleviation of poverty in the history of the world. Is China, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil. Number 1. Number 2, global public health. We haven't eradicated a global disease since smallpox. We're just about to eradicate polio. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, isolated villages, very few people have it within 2 or 3 years. Bill Gates thinks a malaria vaccine is possible in the next 10 to 20 years. Last year, 500,000 kids below the age of 5 died in Africa of malaria. Third, the rise of women. Not everywhere, but certainly in Europe, corporate boards, prime ministers, the new Finnish government, the top 4 civilian officials are women, and they're all young women in their 30s and 40s. It's this new generation, and we've got to create that level playing field in the United States on corporate boards as well as in the White House. And then finally, technology. And my millennial students believe that technology, they believe they can create a carbon-free world by 2050, and they can cure most forms of cancer, and they'll probably do it. If we put enough money into R&D research at MIT and Carnegie Mellon and the new Harvard Engineering School, and it's exciting. And I think my message in ending, if we are going to end, would be we have to spend a lot of time defending the country. We just talked about that tonight. But we have to spend time advancing big, positive human causes. Every generation has done that. We have them. And those 4 goals are ones that we can push forward on, as well as racial equality in America. And yet you need leadership to do it. And we don't have that leader right now. I'm going to be political. But any one of the Democrats on stage tomorrow night would be a better leader. That's what we need to do.
I'll take that round of applause for the Democrats. Now a round of applause for Nick Burns, who's a great guy. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. You guys were wonderful. Thank you for ending on such a note of optimism and shedding light on our place in the world, on democracy, on our allies, on Mookie Betts, and the case you made for the First Amendment and the truth. I want to thank. Let's thank the members of the Murrow Society for being here tonight. We could not do this without you. Let me just say one last thing before I let these two gentlemen off the stage, and you probably desperately need to go home to bed. We actually really want you to think of this as your place, and we would love to get to know you better. We would love to give you a tour of the station. Just let anybody in our development team know that you want to come over and visit us. Come back to City Space. This place is hopping just about every single night of the week. And as members of the Murrow Society, one of your lucky benefits is that you get one of the seats in the front row. Feel free to linger here a little longer. Have a wonderful night. We can't wait to see you back here again. Thank you all so much. Hello.